So as we get going, I invite you to come to the microphone, and I'd like to begin with a question for each of the panelists, which I'd like you to answer both from your respective point of view as a speaker as well as a citizen. And the question is, what policy recommendations do you have for the National Cancer Policy Forum as we think about ensuring the best available data or the best available algorithms going forward? And Mia, I'll start with you.
I think it's becoming clear, and I really want to thank Devin for your talk today, to begin to really empower our patients to be able to be data donors, because a lot of healthcare organizations don't actually behave as though the patient owns their data in any way, whether they're private corporations or public entities. And we really need to shift that so that patients can become the data donors. And I think the technology is getting close, that, with Blue Button and other type of initiatives that are actually on the cusp of being able to make it possible for patients to be more portable in their data sharing or data donation. I think that's a key.
Great. Sean?
I think one of the best areas for new policy would be to re-engineer and reorient the drug development enterprise from a product driven type of sequential paradigm to one that is aligned with the patient's journey. And that's something that can only be accommodated through a collective vision that it's informed by policy. And there are words that we use all the time that are pretty strange when we pull back and think about like what they mean. And they arise from the fact that the drug development enterprise is really focused on the product, not really the patient. For example, patient wasting. If a clinical trial goes bad, we say, oh, the patients were wasted. And say if a phase 1 study failed. We use phrases like loss to follow-up, which is quite fascinating. Patients are continuing on their journey. Once they fall off our radar, we call them lost to follow-up. They no longer, matter. And then recruitment, the concept of recruitment is another one of those anomalies that, we are very much too focused on recruiting patients into our world, rather than, reaching out and going into their world, which would actually nullify the whole meaning of recruitment, because you're vertically orienting product development under the patient's journey, rather than trying to squeeze patients by vertically orienting them on this linear drug development journey that we have.
Fascinating. Devin? So, of course, I agree with Mia. It is consistent with the role that I had at OCR in terms of promoting the HIPAA right of access for patients, and also where I am now at Citizen. But I also think it is incredibly hard for us, notwithstanding the patient's right to get this data. And it's still hard for the patient and the people who are acting on their behalf to get it. Because when you possess the data, it doesn't really matter whether you technically own it or not. Somebody else has to beg your indulgence to get it from you. Which means that, and on top of that, I know from years of sort of working with institutions and researchers about how difficult it is to get all the data you need, we still don't have enough incentives to share data. So whether that's incentives to share data for research purposes that don't route through the patient, or incentives to share data with the patient so that they can route it to research projects, either way, there's too much data hoarding going on, and we need all of it. And David, anything you want to add?
Just that I think I want to highlight Michelle Mello's findings that might have broader applicability about patient attitudes towards data sharing. And it was actually kind of shocking that when she did a very large study that was published in, I think, New England Journal recently, that I think the public and the patients are much more excited about data sharing than researchers are. So.
Very, very true. So with that, I open it up to the mics, and it looks like, Ron, you want to start?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for a very interesting panel. I'm from CMS, but I'm going to take my CMS hat off and put on my pediatric oncologist hat. I've been an oncologist for 25 years, and I think when I started, informed consent was 8 pages, and a few years ago there were 33 pages. And then we had some papers that published that basically showed that parents had no idea what they were signing because they were 33-page documents. And my personal experience, was having a consent conference with a family, telling them their child had cancer, coming back the next morning after the parents had a sleepless night, and them pulling out a 33-page consent, not having read it, and signed it and said, "Great, Doc, I trust you. Just start making my kid better." So I think the fundamental dilemma that I'm hearing is that I'm hearing from the lawyers and the rights advocates that we need more complicated, informed consents to make sure everybody's rights are protected. And I'm hearing from the anthropologists and folks that 20% of college-educated adults don't know whether 1%, 5%, or 10% is a larger number. So I'm just, from a operational standpoint, I'm asking where the middle ground is, so we don't wind up in that pediatric oncology dilemma where we create a 50-page consent that makes the lawyers, the hospital lawyers, and the ethicists happy, but the patients have no idea what they're doing.
Can I just say, I don't think the ethicists like 33-page things that nobody understands. I mean, if lawyers write it,
I'm sorry, I'm going to blame the lawyers.
I think that's always a good idea. It's if only lawyers can understand it, then maybe we should only do research on lawyers. But I think it's interesting that there's a sort of interesting sort of dual history, right? So if you go back to Beecher in the 1960s, who's often cited as the beginning of the informed consent. In late 60s, he said, informed consent in any meaningful sense is impossible to obtain. So they've known since the 60s, we've known that can't be achieved. He thought we should strive for it, but not for the reasons we've typically given. So informed consent, we really need to rethink about what the role and the purpose of informed consent. What we're really trying to do is show respect for patients. The idea that this is like autonomous decision-making and the myth that this is sort of autonomous self-determination, empirically, tons of studies show that is not achieved, and it's probably not achievable. So what we're really trying to do is demonstrate respect for the patients in different ways, and informed consent plays an important role in demonstrating that respect. But a 33-page document that nobody understands, that somebody just signs their name to without reading, has no part of that process is that showing respect for the people that you're communicating with or interacting with. So I think in a lot of ways we need to sort of go back to square one in terms of how we think about how we communicate with people, which is what this is really about. So what is communication really about, so that there's some level of understanding as much as we can get. But knowing that that's going to be imperfect, which it absolutely is, the question really is, what are the different ways that we can use the informed consent as well as other tools to demonstrate respect for patients?
Devin? Yeah, I don't disagree at all. I actually think that the direction that some of these laws are heading in is not the right one, given all that we know about how oftentimes people don't understand consents, don't read them when they're presented with them. I mean, how many of you since GDPR got enacted who have been getting those cookie things every time you go to a website, you just click through it? I click through them. And I'm supposed to read this stuff. This is what I do for a living. It's just when you want what you want, and particularly when you're sick, you're going to sign anything that's put in front of you. It is not more empowering to have a consent form shoved in front of you, or even to have a really nice consent process necessarily, although there are certainly ways to do it better. And we're trying to do that in the All of Us program, for example. I like what David said about finding other ways to honor people, and it will be a challenge for all of us, really, to sort of figure out what is an appropriate sort of framework for honoring and respecting individuals who contribute their data for research, whether it's through their institutions or direct donation, without necessarily pulling the rug over their eyes, frankly, within consent forms that they're not reading. And that is a huge challenge.
And actually, I want to build on one thing she said, if I can just say one more thing, which is the way in which we communicate with people in writing is absolutely the worst thing we could do to try and convey information. Everything we know says that is a terrible way. We did a randomized trial with different ways of communicating information to people using illustrated videos, comics, and other things. Something that approximates the standard informed consent was absolutely at the bottom of being able to actually communicate information. And I think that's right. These more novel communication techniques is one of the reasons why the All of Us campaign so far, a research project, is getting such stunningly amazing outcomes in terms of the uptake of information and levels of understanding on the point of participants.
Thank you.
More than I would have ever thought
And I would
possible.
just add that in pediatric oncology, we've since gone back in the other direction now as a result of those papers.
So maybe one of the policy recommendations for Cheryl and the team is that as the National Cancer Policy Forum, we should take forward a process to rethink about the consenting process within oncology, given how important it is to everything we do, as well as reliable data sets. Question over here.
Hi, Bray Patrick Lake, Duke Clinical Research Institute. This is for Devin and perhaps others. So we talked about privacy, but I'm wondering about transparency. Do you see any efforts that are being launched to really make it transparent to data or to patients about how their data is being shared? And I want to link this to two things. So one, I think it's autonomy, and patients, we want to share, but we also want to know how we're sharing. I think blockchain's been, really interesting to us because we want that footprint. But also data quality. I pick up on a comment that was made earlier where it's really concerning when you go in your medical record and you find out that something's wrong. Or I saw LexisNexis is selling social determinants of health. I logged in, mine are completely wrong, not even close to anything, about me, and it's being sold and put into data sets. So anything about transparency that you can reveal?
Yeah, it's another one of those fair information practice principles that, frankly, has long taken a backseat to emphasizing consent over being more clear with people about how their data are used, again, on a more regular basis. It's another one that also sort of tends to fail because what people do is they post things on websites or they give people long notices, and there's not really an effort to engage with people. I've seen some examples, some of the PCORNet projects, for example, where they are working directly with patient populations and getting both regular input from them about the types of research that is of interest to them, but also, returning results, keeping them informed about the progress of the research where they can do so without necessarily biasing or compromising the research. I think there are lots of ways, and they all sort of center around not treating people as subjects, but treating them as participants. Again, all of us and other research initiatives around the country that have started to go down that path.
So I did want to just add, it's tangential a little bit to what your question is, but it's on the flip side of the research data that gets generated and whether or not research data that gets generated is shared in the public domain. There's been a lot more emphasis to, and this gets back to what kind of policies should be put into place. That if you're not doing, if the research that you're doing doesn't produce data that's worth sharing, perhaps that's not research worth doing, right? But there's all this concern about secondary use of research data and the transparency around it, not only for the quality of the data, which is incredibly important, but also for the credit that the person who generated the data in the first place gets for having generated that data that now becomes part of a larger study that's aggregating data from multiple institutions or multiple projects. So I think that the transparency question not only extends from, how is my data as an individual patient being used in many projects, but how is the data that I'm generating as a researcher being used in other projects, and can I get micro credit for it in some way to be a data donor and encourage that from a promotion perspective within the academic institutions, as well as from the data that I generated had value beyond the experiment for which I was funded to do.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Elaine Shatner, a patient advocate and a contributor to Forbes. I have a question for Dr. Abernethy. I like very much your presentation. I've been following Flatiron, and I see you're collaborating with a lot of groups. But since Roche purchased Flatiron, what is the company doing, Flatiron, that is to protect itself from bias, not just in results published, but even in what questions it looks at in terms of which drugs it explores, et cetera?
Well, this is a great question. It is certainly something that kind of not really haunts me, but I think about every single day as the chief medical officer. The way that we're currently handling it is what we call literally the non-integration integration, where Flatiron is completely separate from Roche. How long that will really stand, I can't comment, but I think that what that looks like right now is that we work with every single life sciences company and academic who wants to work with us, and Roche does not get preferential treatment in that. As a matter of fact, if anything, Roche is now starting to become lower on the list because we're worried about giving Roche preferential treatment around research questions. It means means that ultimately, because the data come from oncology clinics and patients in oncology clinics, and because of Stark laws, we actually need to make sure that we keep the process of what we do with data at Flatiron completely separate from Roche, because Roche as a pharmaceutical company cannot own or sort of the activities that go on within clinics, and we need to keep that separate. Ultimately, what we've been trying to do also is prioritize research questions that have a social good for at least about 10% of the work that we're doing, to make sure that we're doing work that's outside of the pharmaceutical space. It is not perfect, and if you have additional suggestions, I would love to hear them.
Hi, I'm Nick Petrick from the FDA, and my question is, a lot of the talk, and I understand it, is around sort of this donation of data, whether that's from institutions or from individuals. And what I want to talk about, or want to ask the question is, the data itself has obviously value. People wouldn't hoard it if it didn't have value. Is there a role for industry or other groups to monetize that data in a way where it's easier to aggregate, get people to volunteer or utilize that data? I'm not talking about in a clinical trial where there's benefit potentially to the patient, but this idea that the data exists in a clinical context and it could be utilized in this larger context for AI or other research. And I just wondered people's thoughts on whether there's a role there for industry in helping that advance that along more quickly.
Start, Sean, and I'll add in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we assume that data is an asset, then we can also think about that. So if we have this very valuable digital asset, how can we bring in incentives that accommodates distribution of this data widely beyond altruism? Because there's only so much that you could force people to be altruistic without, at some point exercising too much top-down control that can have unintended consequences. So absolutely, and in fact, we at the FDA have a blockchain effort that was really originally, we launched that effort with the thinking that can we provide a neutral platform for anyone to exchange digital assets at either for free or however they wish to conduct that transaction without any third party being involved. So in that sense, the legal owners of the data, whether it's an institution or the patient, the individual patient, should have an option to distribute the data based on the appropriate incentive for them, whether it's altruism, research, or an economic incentive. Because pragmatically speaking, those are the same incentives that have scaled everything else in the world, in society. And health data is no different than that. And the fact that patients are now individuals gaining more and more access to their data. If you go to your health app, for example, if you have an iOS device, you have an electronic health record there where you can start to think about exchanging data. People may not be aware of that, but during the break, you may want to take a look at that. So there will be more individual ownership of data, and that's the direction that society is moving. And also, there's going to be institutions, innovators who know how to aggregate and curate that data to make it even more valuable. And then the market decides, where that data goes and how it's exchanged. I think it's a great question. I think there's a lot of room to really think about policy positions that could accommodate such a world where the data is flowing freely. If we believe that by free flow of data can make the world a better place.
So I'm going to add just one thing really quickly, and that's that in order to solve a lot of the challenges that we're seeing, we really need the tech industry motivated to innovate and solve those challenges, which means that we need the business models to go along with it. That's part one. Part two is there's probably not one solution. And so what we want to do is see many solutions flourish so that we're able to basically get best in breed across time. The third point is that, as Mia showed, the same piece of data, so data is a non-depletable resource. It can be copied and shared many different times. So it may be even one particular patient's donated data that now gets curated in many different ways and represented in data sets. The challenge ultimately being the need to deduplicate. But outside of that, the fact that really solving this in different ways is really important. And I think the fourth point is that we're going to start to see a lot of the boundaries that are placed around proprietary data sets start to crumble as we realize that aggregating data is the true way that we get to personalization. And I think I'm starting to see that already.
I just want to add one thing is that, at least from a research perspective, research data, it actually costs people money to donate data. There's effort, there's technological transformation of the data into formats that can be uploaded to public repositories. The public repositories are not exactly easy use today. So while there might be economic models downstream for the people who are generating it and putting it in the first place, there's a cost to them for doing it. And we don't currently fund within our research projects the upload portion of the research. And it is a gap that needs to be addressed in review boards to say, hey, where's your budget for uploading your data at the end of the project?
It looks like we have 3 questions left in about 3.5 minutes, so we're going to try and do all 3.
Sure. I'm going to actually really quick comment and a question. The quick comment is that obviously in the wake of Tuskegee, we had an IRB and things not only happening to the folks in Tuskegee in Alabama, but the IRB also happened to them without them being at the table. It's clearly important that for diversity's sake, obviously geographic diversity, racial diversity, we focused a lot. But to your last point, how are you guys ensuring that there's class diversity that's actually also at the table? Because as you discuss this, whether you're African American or white, if you're in that top 1%, your data technology and savvy may be very different than someone in Beattyville, Kentucky. So one of the missing questions that I actually have is, how are you thinking about, again, class being at the table as you are thinking about your technologies? Sorry to be a pain.
I don't think it's a pain at all. I think I am very open to input. I mean, at that very basic level, we are empowering individuals to get data from wherever they've been treated, and we're taking on all of the legwork associated with that because it's too hard. So we'll take that on, but I suspect those people don't even know, well, nobody knows who we are. We only have like 10 beta patients right now, but we'll get bigger. But in the meantime, being even aware that things like this exist, how do you reach populations and how do you also gain their trust? Whether that is through making sure we have the right complement of staff, that we're not all representative of, the upper echelon and that or whether we have advisory boards. I don't know that there's a magical answer to this, but I truly want the users of our product to be from all spectra of society, from the top down in terms of level of income. It's super hard to achieve because I don't know why anybody who hasn't heard of us will just trust us right off the bat. And how do we build that is really, really, really critical and deliver value to people, something they can really use.
Can I just say at least for the All of Us campaign, I think they've been pretty successful at reaching those groups. I think we know how to do that. It's just that it's time intensive, expensive. It means going to the places where individuals and there are tools for doing good engagement to succeed in achieving socioeconomic diversity. What's interesting to me is right now the data seems to suggest, at least in the early stages of recruitment, they've achieved actually pretty good socioeconomic diversity. If you look at the incomes, it's actually a pretty diverse group that's pretty representative. Not for education. Usually those two things are highly correlated, but they're seeing it's skewing higher for education, but the socioeconomic diversity is pretty good. So I think we have to look at all those different dimensions to really try and get a diverse population.
We're not doing good on our minutes, but the last 2 questions over here, maybe we can combine it fast.
Okay. Lisa Kennedy, Sheldon Oncology Nursing Society. We've heard today, obviously, that one drug, one target or mutation is not where we are anymore, that we're moving into complex care. In the world of accelerated approvals, and Dr. Kozin, this is for you, how are we going to collect real-world evidence so that we can not only get at attributing progress in care, but also adverse events in care so that we get those safety signals? It's
a very complex question. It's a great question. I realize we're running out of time, but just to summarize some of the key issues there and opportunities. Obviously, to increase representation in clinical studies, and this also addresses the last question, we need to be more proactive and go beyond the confines of traditional clinical trial boundaries. Only 3% of adult oncology patients are in clinical trials. So, and real-world evidence is really that opportunity. And there are a series of discussions and scientific experiments that we have been doing and we need to continue to conduct to understand how do we articulate safety and efficacy in the real world. And the whole concept of real-world endpoints. And these endpoints could be for efficacy and also safety. And these endpoints will be different than how we measure and capture endpoints in traditional clinical trials, as they should be, and there are advantages to that. It's not like we're compromising or lowering standards. We're actually trying to incorporate the patient preference, the patient experience, and that patient-centeredness into developing real-world endpoints that can accommodate extracting data from the point of care, from electronic health records. And this is, in fact, aligned with what Congress wants us to do. In the 24th Century Cures Act, there's a directive to the FDA to design and develop drug development tools, and these real-world endpoints are drug development tools. Also, Congress has directed us to enhance and increase our activities in terms of patient-focused drug development. So we've had a couple of workshops. There was a workshop earlier this month, a new guidance that is being developed. And all of these efforts collectively are allowing us to capture better real-world experience, better patient experience data from electronic health records. And then we have to also align that with what CDRH is doing. I know my colleague from CDRH is here, Bikul Patel, the Director of Digital Health. We're really taking digital health very seriously because that can allow us a new pipeline of data that is coming directly from the individual, from the patient. So CDRH, under leadership of Bikul and others, are developing new frameworks to allow the FDA come up with standards to be able to capture digital health data as part of that continuum of the patient experience.
So I'm sorry, Larry, but I really appreciate everybody's time here today. I appreciate the panel. And Larry, for your final question, we'll hopefully answer it up here later. Thank you. Have a great day.